Hello, my name is Dr. Laura Davis, and this is a short video on the notion of place in the work of Alice Munro, the Canadian writer. And I'm going to start off by talking about place in general in Canadian literature, and then I'm going to get a little bit more specific and talk about Alice Munro and the notion of place in her works, and specifically in the first story of Lives of Girls and Women called The Flats Road. So I will say that time and place are very much interwoven in Munro's work and in all work, I would say, in Canadian literature. So it's important to think about the concept of time as we also think about the concept of place in her work. Let's see. I guess I would start by talking about the notion of place in the Canadian consciousness in general, and there's the sense of outsiderness that is in general a kind of Canadian sensibility that comes across in Canadian literature. So often when you ask Canadians to think about a time in history, for example, or place, an important event that stuck with them, they'll actually refer to American events or perhaps European events, such as, for example, 9/11 or the shooting of Kennedy, as moments that they remember. So rather than thinking about Canadian moments, they think about American moments, or in some cases English or European moments. So there's a sense of being outside of some of the world news events or the so-called important events that matter in the Canadian consciousness. And I think that this comes through often in the literature of Canada. One thing is that in much of Canadian literature then, there's a kind of sense of need to write one's own place. And so historically, so for example, when you have writers like Margaret Lawrence writing for the first time about the Canadian prairies, and those becoming public amongst Canadians, there was a real sense of finally someone is writing our place. It's outside of the center. It's outside of the center of a major Canadian city like Toronto, for example. It's outside of the center of big American and English cities that so-called important things seem to happen in. And there is a sense of joy, I would say, at this notion that finally these other places that aren't considered center are being written. So if you look at the work of writers such as the Canadian writer Robert Croach, for example, he wrote a book, and I believe he wrote these essays in the 1980s, called The Lovely Treachery of Words. And in that book, he very much talks about not learning the history and the literature of the place in which he resides. So he was writing out of central Alberta, Canada, and he talks in his essays about finding teepee stones and indigenous arrowheads on his farm in central Alberta where he grew up, and kind of being dismayed and even angered at the sense that he did not learn about the history of this place that he now occupies, that the history he was learning about in schools, the literature that he was taking up in schools, was not from the place where he resides. It was instead primarily American history. If it was Canadian history, it was history that took place in central Canada, eastern Canada, for example, and literature that took place and that was written out of England and America. So he really wrote at that time to the need to writing place and a place that spoke to Canadians and to kind of legitimizing the place in which one writes. Okay, another thing I just want to talk about briefly is the notion of haunting in Canadian literature. And haunting, of course, has to do with both place and time. So on the one hand, haunting happens in certain places. Ghosts haunt houses or abandoned buildings or places. So it is very much tied to place. Haunting is also tied to time because it is something from the past that comes back, that inserts itself into the present. It's a kind of conflation of past and conflation of past and present, an eruption of the past into the present. And in Canadian literature, there is quite a lot of haunting going on. In Alice Munro's Flats Road, you have haunting, of course, with the story of Sandy Steveston and him being haunted by his wife's former husband. So a couple of books that I would recommend with regard to haunting in Canadian literature. Cynthia Sugars and Jerry Turcotte wrote a book called Unsettled Remains, Canadian Literature in the Post-Colonial Gothic, and another one called Dispossession, Haunting in Canadian Fiction, and that one's by Marlene Goldman. So if you want to go further with the notion of haunting, you can look in those two places. I would also say that one of the reasons that haunting is so prevalent in Canadian literature is because of this kind of anxiety over place, and it's really a kind of settler anxiety. So a work to read in this regard is a work by Anna Johnson and Alan Lawson. It's a little bit dated now, but I think very relevant still, called Settler Colonies, and it talks about how settler colonization was different from the colonization of occupied territories and so on. So in that sense, there's a sense with settler Canadian literature of anxiety in the places in which we reside, the sense that it isn't really our land because of the Indigenous presence on the land before the settlers got there. So you will find this in a lot of Canadian literature, a kind of anxiety over place and anxiety over home, the notion that the land that one's on is not truly one's home from a settler perspective because of the Indigenous history and presence there, that settlers don't really have a right to the land that they're on. And on the other hand, as Anne Johnson and Alan Lawson point out, there's a not really much of a tie to the imperial centre either for settlers. So there's very much a kind of sense that settler literature is in this ambiguous liminal space, and I think that that anxiety to do with place comes across very much in the literature. So I will look just a little bit for you about if we can think about that concept in the Flats Road at the very beginning of the story. You'll notice on the first page, it takes place on a riverbank, a very liminal space on the edge of the land and the water. And one of the things that's interesting about the way that the riverbank is discussed in the very opening to the Flats Road is that there is this kind of anxiety over whose place is it, and whether Dell and her brother really have a right to be on this land. So at first they talk about their Uncle Benny and they say, well, he wasn't our uncle or anyone's. So in a sense there's this ownership over Uncle Benny, and then there's this pulling back and dispossession of ownership. He doesn't belong to anybody. And then you have the same thing happening with the land. He says, Uncle Benny says, you kids want to splash in the mud and scare off the fish, you go and do some place else. Get off my riverbank. So Uncle Benny's claiming the riverbank on his own. And then Dell, the narrator, says it wasn't his, it was ours, meaning her brothers and hers. So I think in this, again, is a kind of settler anxiety over who has the right to be on this land in the first place. So opening on a liminal space, anxiety over the settler anxiety over ownership of the land. And later in the text we'll find, of course it's called the Flats Road. The Flats Road where Dell lives is also in a kind of liminal space between the country and the city. And there's all sorts to say about the notion of that space, which is, as Dell says herself, not the country or the city. She sees the city as kind of civilized on the one hand, with the lanterns and the ice boxes and the postmans and so on. And then going into the country, there's this kind of sense of a changing class, that she's moving outside of a kind of civilization into kind of a lower class sensibility, which she's ashamed of in some ways. So the Flats Road itself is on the edge of a kind of territory. And in this story as well, I believe it's this story, there is a sense that they're near the train tracks. And of course, trains are very significant in Canadian literature and Canadian history, with the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway and the kind of unity that was said to give to Canada as a whole. So this kind of gesture towards train tracks and trains and so on in terms of place is also really interesting in Munro's work. Okay, that's it for part one of Munro, of my talk about Munro. I will be doing others. I hope you enjoyed this short talk on Munro and place and the Flats Road. Thank you.